This is where we left off in our last class. We had looked at all of these sounds. And so to supplement that class, I would like to add these last few sounds down here at the bottom in this video. So we have 4 approximants, one of which is a lateral approximant. It might look like there are 5 approximants, but you can notice your friend W is both bilabial and velar, and we'll talk about that in this slideshow. So we'll start with 2 approximants that are called the liquids. So if you look at this picture, you see the tongue is pressed against the alveolar ridge, and that is actually a sound we saw previously. So watching this video now, can you tell me what sound we looked at that looked like this? Now, it's not that sound, the sound that is the alveolar stop. So this is the articulation of D or T, but this is not a D or T. It's actually a cross section of a sound that looks like it, but there's air escaping. And so now, while watching this video, can you tell me if this is the cross section, where could air escape? So this is, to think about it, the sound is L. So first, I hope you notice when you say an L or L, that you put your tongue there on the alveolar ridge, just like a D. So a D and an L, your tongue is touching the same place. But when you make an L, can you feel where that air is escaping? It comes around the sides. Sometimes it actually sounds the same if it's one side, or both sides, or of course the other side. It always sounds the same because it's a big enough opening, it doesn't make a difference. Now the nice thing is, if we have a L sound in a word, it's always written with an L. We'll talk in a little bit about how it can be a syllabic consonant. It can be its own syllable. But for a preview of that, we can look at these cases where you have bottle, middle, pickle, ripple, tonal, palatal, labial. All of those end with an ol. So bottle. It's not bodle. We're not getting an actual vowel in there. It's just bod, ol, an L by itself. And we couldn't do this with fricatives or stops, but now with approximants, you'll find they can be their own syllable. And that sort of accounts for this funny spelling, right? With LE, they put the vowel after it. With AL, they put the vowel before, and that's because they couldn't quite figure out. They knew there was a syllable there, and so they're representing that with the vowel, but they put it on both sides because it's not really either side. The syllable is that consonant. So if you want to write the syllabic version, you can put a little line under the L. You don't have to, though, because we can predict where these sounds occur. Oh, now we've changed articulation. Look at this new one. So this might look a little bit like the one we saw for j. So remember that symbol, the edge is j, the sound that's in the middle of pleasure, the beginning of genre, and the end of garage. But in any case, this isn't quite a j. See, the tongue is all bunched up in the back there. There's this big, like, camel hump in the back. So this is the alveolar liquid. Now you might be saying, what's that R doing upside down? Well, we talk about how this is the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. And so the Spanish trill that we hear in the word perro, that is what the right side up R is used for. So at that conference, the Spanish speaking people won. They got to choose the right side up symbol. Now, because we don't have any r's in English, I'm okay with you using a right side up R, especially if you're typing and it's hard to find the upside down R. I'm going to continue to try to use the upside down R because that is the alveolar liquid. We've also seen this sound, the R, but it's missing that little serif on the top. Many languages that write an R actually say this sound. So in Spanish, pero, meaning but, or this word, in Japanese, arigato, the word for thank you, arigato, that ri here is the Japanese R sound. We'll talk more about this flap sound in English in 2 weeks, which we do have it in English, but usually not for what's written as an R. So an R can also be syllabic. We actually talked about this a little bit already. And sometimes it's ER, OR, or AR. So color, actor, professor, teacher, meter, cellular, polar. So when you say, for example, polar, you go straight from the L to the R. Polar. There's no vowel in between there. There's not really many cases of the vowel written after it, but you've probably seen the British and Canadian spelling of center where the R comes before the E. So we have that same sort of confusion about where I feel like there's something like a vowel here, but where is it? And again, we can write the R with a little line under it to distinguish it from the non-syllabic version, but again, we don't have to. In our next class, we'll talk about the sound written this way, and that's another context. For now, on your 4th hour, feel free to use the upside down R and write the line under it if you want to mark it as syllabic. So those are our only 2 liquids, L and R, and you've probably know some languages that have just an L or just an R, and so those accents sometimes mix them up in English. But now we're moving into our last class of approximants, the glides. So the 2 liquids are L and R, or L and R, and now we have 2 glides to talk about. So this one also looks like a little bit, but the tongue is further back, so it's not post-alveolar like a j, and it's also further away from the top of the mouth. Remember, we said with manner of sound, things get further and further away. They get more and more open. So we call this one a palatal sound, not a post-alveolar sound. So this is yi, typically written with a Y in English. And this is the bane of many linguistics introduction students' lives because they want to write a Y like we do in English, but in the IPA, it's the Y. And if you speak German or Dutch or any Scandinavian language, you're used to seeing a J as a Y sound. But if you speak French or Spanish or Portuguese or English, you need to learn that the J is a different thing. And because the word J is misleading, sometimes linguists call this sound a yod when they're talking about it as the sound it makes. So yeah, all these cases are a Y, right? So yes, yellow, yesterday, bayou, canyon. Maybe not so much the last one of yesterday, although that is a little bit of yeah. I probably meant to mark the first one. And you might notice by the symbols that E and Y are similar. Remember, we talked about how this is an E, and that is in your 4th hour as an E. So it's not surprising that the letter that we call I can be Y. So if you look at words like view, onion, union, million, billion, if you pronounce them as 2 syllables, obviously if you say million or billion, it's an E sound. But if you say million, billion, it is a Y. We'll talk in a little bit about cases like action and mission. That's a little bit of a special case. Just make sure you're not using the IPA symbol that looks like a Y for this sound. If you're curious about that IPA symbol, like you were curious about the right side up R as r, this one is a non-English vowel. So this is used, if you know the French word for moon, lune, that U sound, that's what the symbol is used for. Or if you know the German word for green, grün, that's what that symbol is used for. So never use a Y in the IPA for English. So one thing else we have to say about the Y sound is, the English letter U is palatalized. So remember, this is a palatal sound. And so the letter U, if you've learned other languages, you probably know it's called U. For example, if you sing the alphabet in French or in Spanish, you say U for this. But in English, we don't say U, we say U. So it's actually just it makes two sounds in one, sort of like we know X is a K plus a S, right? Well, this letter is a Y plus an U. And so we'll talk about its pronunciation in stressed syllables here. So if I ask you what's the first sound in unit or university or use or utility, the correct answer is a yod. It looks like a J, but we call it a yod, so it's not confusing. So they don't start with an U, right? We don't say unit, university, us, or utility. Now in French, they do. They say université and utilité. So they don't have that y. But English has this property of u where it's got the y sound, and so we have to represent that in our transcriptions. This is even true if it's not at the beginning. So we have to say the y sound here. Feudal, puny, bucolic, municipal, cute, and human. So they sound wrong if you don't have the y. Feudal, puny, bucolic, municipal, cute, human. Actually, municipal doesn't sound bad. I guess some people do say it. I say municipal. In the UK, they do this with even more sounds. So I grew up in the US saying tutor, duty, student, and nuisance. But if you hear someone with many kinds of English accents, they'll say tutor, duty, student, and nuisance. And maybe even this happens with suit. So instead of suit, it's suit. All right, we just talked about that. So unless you have an English accent, you don't need a y for those words. And maybe you're even noticing, if you're really on top of things in this class, after the alveolar sounds, t, d, and n, that's where we don't get the palatalization in the US. That's, of course, an advanced topic, but maybe you noticed, and I wanted to tell you you were correct if you did. Approximates don't do this even in the UK. So in the UK, as far as I know, no one says real or lute. Those are really hard to say. Approximates, remember, liquids are a type of approximates, so we can't do the same thing. So it's just these ones: fia, pia, bia, mia, kya, and hya. You can hear those with a couple other spellings, like in the word beautiful and few. And so in the UK, when they talk about the word new, they say new. So you see these two distinct pronunciations here, right? But they are pretty close. So we talked about how zh shown here and y shown here are pretty close. And because of that proximity, we get a little bit of back and forth between these sounds in English. Sorry about that. Okay, so back to this. We were looking at these two sounds. So we now we're going to talk about the unstressed pronunciation of these sounds, of the letter U specifically. So we just said, remember, after approximates, we don't do it. We don't say real or lute. Well, in unstressed syllables, we actually do that. So value and virulent. So people don't say value or virulent, if you know that word. And remember, we didn't say nuisance, we said nuisance. But if the syllable's not stressed, like an annual or menu, we do have that palatal effect on the U. And with the other alveolar sounds, the ones we talked about in class, t, d, s, and z, there's a sort of a sound change. And this is where we see that connection between post-alveolars and palatals. So a t, y becomes a ch. So actual, ritual, mutual, situation, sanctuary. It's a ch sound, just like we saw that post-alveolar voiceless affricate, not tia. So it might sound sort of okay with tia. So actual, ritual, mutual, situation, but those don't sound quite right to me. I really sound better to me with the ch. So same here, graduation, individual, residual, arduous. And then So yeah becomes sh. So the stops become affricates and the fricatives become different fricatives. Assure, pressure, issue, tissue. So you can see at some point in English, it was assure, pressure, issue, tissue, and that yeah became sh. And finally, zya becomes ja. And this is sort of why we have a ja in English. Aside from words like garage and genre, the main reason we have a ja is because of this sound change from zya to ja. So we don't say visual, usual, casual. They all become j's. So visual, usual, casual, azure, and seizure. So sometimes it's a Z, sometimes it's written with an S, but it's a Z sound. So this is not the best drawing I've ever done. I have not been able to do a better drawing of our last glide that we have to talk about in this video. So this is the last consonant that we'll look at in English, or to be more technical, it's the last phonemic consonant, but we haven't talked about what phonemes are yet. So this sound is articulated in two different places at the same time, right? We looked at the affricates that have two articulations, but they're one after the other. This is two places of articulation at the same time. So first, you can see the tongue almost touches the velum here. It's not very close. This is not a fricative. We don't have velar fricatives in English. We don't have like German does, for example. But there's also an articulation at the lips. The lips are rounded. So just like for the vowel oo, we have the same position for the consonant oo, the W. And so this is called a labio-velar glide because it's said at the lips, labio, and velar at the velum. And we said how y and e were close. Well, w and u are also close. That's why a W, even though it looks like a double V, is called a W. So in a couple words, you even pronounce a U as a W. So suede and suave, and then lots of them with G, like penguin, distinguish, and linguist. So I don't hear people saying penguin. I think there was a meme on the internet about like Benedict Cumberbatch saying penguin like 10 years ago, but aside from that, no. And it also really helps explain, maybe you've always wondered of why QU is pronounced KW. Well, it's just like a GU being pronounced GW. And then Q is sort of a leftover different type of K. So in quick, equal, eloquent, and earthquake, those are all quas, and the U is pronounced W, just like in these words here. So one last thing I want to say about this sound is you might know some people either from Scotland or Ireland or the southern or western US who have different pronunciations depending if it's written with a WH or just a W. So WH for those people is a voiceless labiovelar glide. All the sounds we've talked about in this video, and they're all voiced. Your vocal folds are vibrating for all of them. But for some people, they have this voiceless glide. And it sort of sounds like a hua, but for the native speakers, a lot of times it is actually a voiceless glide. So you'll hear it in whales and whine, as opposed to whales and wine. And for me, and probably for a lot of you, these words are homophone. They sound the same. So if I say I like Wales, you don't know if I'm talking about the constituent country of the UK or the large ocean-going mammal. So for most of us, we just have voiced approximants, but maybe one or two people in this class natively have this, or you have a relative who has the hua sound. It used to be, though, that all English speakers had a voiced and voiceless distinction. This is why this distinction exists in our spelling. And this is why, like we talked about in class a few days ago, the word who, whose, and whole are pronounced with an H because the H part survived, not the W part. So once upon a time, these were pronounced whoo, whoos, and whole, and then they lost their W's. So now we can finally say that we've got all the sounds. We started with these stops, paba, tada, kaga, and all of these sounds stop the air completely. No air comes out of the nose or mouth. Then we looked at the nasal stops, also called nasals, where no air comes out of the mouth, but air comes freely out of the nose because the velum is forward. Then we looked at a first series of fricatives, fv, th, sz, h. There's voiced and voiceless ones, except for h, which can't be voiced because voicing happens in the glottis. And then we looked at, instead of post-alveolar sounds, the affricates ch and j, and the fricatives sh and j. And finally, when we got to this video, we looked at the approximants. So we have 4 of them, remember? We have r, the alveolar approximant, l, the lateral approximant, lateral because the air comes around the sides of the tongue to make the noise. We looked at the palatal stop y, and remember, this is not doesn't represent the sound that J represents in English spelling. This is a y. And then one more that we write in 2 places on the chart, the labiovelar approximant w. But that's just one sound written in 2 places to remind you about the 2 articulations. So that is all the sounds of consonants we have in English phonemically. So this last one, the glottal stop, we'll get to that when we start talking about the phonology of English a little bit later. But certainly now know everything you need to know about the consonants, and you're ready to do the second 4th hour activity. Good luck with that, and I'll see you in class.